The moonlight bled through the high, arched windows, painting the stone floors in shades of silver and bone. Every footstep echoed like a betrayal in the heart of Blackwood Keep, each one a countdown to her own unmaking. She could smell them, the wolves, a thick primal scent of pine, damp earth, and barely restrained power that coated the back of her throat. They called her human, a word that felt like a curse spat from their tongues, but the mark hidden beneath the worn wool of her sleeve burned with a truth older than their scorn. Her mother's last words were a whisper against the roaring fear in her heart. "Show him the mark. He is your blood." But blood was a dangerous thing in a kingdom built on secrets, and hers was about to drown them all. The twin doors to the throne room were carved from obsidian, vast and silent as a tomb. The two guards flanking them didn't move. Their eyes, a chilling, predatory gold, tracked her approach. They were colossal figures, clad in black leather and steel, the sigil of a snarling wolf etched onto their pauldrons. One of them let out a low, contemptuous sniff, the sound vibrating in the cavernous hall. "The king does not see strays," he rumbled, his voice like grinding stones. Seraphine's hands trembled, but she forced them into fists at her sides. She had walked for 3 weeks, slept in ditches and hollow logs, and eaten what little she could forage, all for this single moment. Fear was a luxury she could no longer afford. She lifted her chin, meeting the guard's gaze with a stillness she had perfected over a lifetime of being less than nothing. "I carry a message for King Ilarion. From his father." The name of the late King Theron was a forbidden word, a ghost that still haunted these halls. The guard's sneer faltered, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. He exchanged a look with his silent counterpart. The air grew thick, heavy with unspoken questions. Before he could deny her again, one of the massive doors groaned inward, pulled open by an unseen force. An invitation, or a trap. It made no difference. Seraphine took a steadying breath, the scent of burning logs and old power washing over her, and stepped across the threshold. The throne room was a cathedral of shadows and might. Dozens of wolves lined the cavernous space, their forms draped in furs and leathers, their faces hard and unreadable in the flickering torchlight. They stood silent and watchful, a forest of predators judging the deer that had wandered into their midst. The air was electric with hostility, a physical pressure that sought to bring her to her knees. Whispers slithered through the silence like smoke, sharp and cruel. "Human. Look at the rags she wears. The stench of weakness." She ignored them, her focus narrowed to the far end of the hall. There, upon a dais of jagged black stone, sat the throne. It was not forged of gold and velvet, but carved from the petrified heartwood of an ancient lightning-struck oak, its back twisting into the shape of a howling wolf's head, and upon it, cloaked in shadow, sat the reason she was here. Silence fell, not as a request, but as a command that ripped the air from every lung. From the shadows of the immense throne, a presence uncoiled. It wasn't just a man who sat there, but the very soul of the mountain. Ancient, unforgiving, and absolute. They called him King Ilarion Vane, but the name was too small for the aura of raw dominance that pressed down on her, stealing her breath. A low, resonant growl, more vibration than sound, rumbled from his chest, and in the gloom, 2 eyes ignited like embers in the heart of a dying fire. He was larger than any of the wolves in the hall, his shoulders a testament to brutal strength, his dark hair falling unbound around a face carved from granite. A jagged scar sliced through one eyebrow, disappearing into his hairline, a story of violence she didn't want to know. He didn't move, yet Seraphine felt as though she were being physically held in his gaze, pinned and dissected. "You have interrupted my court," he said. His voice was a low thunder, a sound that resonated deep in her bones and made the fine hairs on her arms stand on end. "You have wasted my time. State your purpose before I have you thrown to the hounds. They have not been fed since morning." The threat was not an idle one. A ripple of cruel amusement went through the assembled court. Seraphine's heart hammered against her ribs. A frantic bird in a cage of bone. This was it. The moment her mother had prepared her for her entire life. The moment she had dreaded with every fiber of her being. She took a step forward, then another, her worn boots making no sound on the polished stone. She stopped in the center of the hall, the full weight of his stare burning her skin. "My name is Seraphine Dareth." Her voice was quiet, but it carried in the oppressive silence. "I have come to claim what is mine by blood." A wave of shocked muttering swept the room. Claim? A human, a waif in rags, dared to speak of claims in the den of the Alpha King? Alarion leaned forward slightly, the movement fluid and dangerous, like a panther gathering itself to strike. The torchlight caught the hard planes of his face, revealing a cruel beauty that was as terrifying as it was mesmerizing. "Blood," he repeated, the word a blade wrapped in velvet. "You are human. You have no blood that matters within these walls." "I have his," she said, her voice shaking only slightly. She raised a hand and pointed, not at him, but at the magnificent portrait of the former king that hung on the wall, King Theron Vane, his father. "I am his daughter." The room erupted. Shouts of blasphemy and lies echoed off the stone walls. Growls tore through the air, low and menacing, the sound of a pack ready to rip apart an intruder. The guards by the door took a menacing step forward, their hands resting on the hilts of their swords, but Ilarion did not move. He simply raised one hand, and the chaos died instantly, strangled in the throats of his wolves. The sheer undisputed power in that simple gesture stole Seraphine's breath. He stared at her, his fiery eyes narrowed to slits, searching her face for the lie. "My father had no other children," he stated, his voice dangerously soft. "He had a queen, he had one son. An heir, me. Any other claim is a falsehood spoken by a whore or a fool. Which are you?" The insult struck her like a physical blow, but her mother's face flashed in her mind. Pale, loving, and dying, she had made a promise. "My mother was no whore," she said, her voice ringing with a strength she didn't know she possessed. "She was a woman your father loved. He gave her a promise, and he gave me this." Slowly, deliberately, she reached for the cuff of her worn woolen tunic. Her fingers fumbled with the rough fabric. The court held its breath, their collective focus a tangible force. She pushed the sleeve up her forearm, past her elbow. There, against the pale skin of her inner arm, was the mark. It was a delicate silver crescent moon, nestled within the curve of a single etched star. It was not a tattoo, not a brand, but a birthmark woven into her very skin, shimmering with a faint, otherworldly luminescence in the dim light. The royal mark of the Vane bloodline. A mark said to be bestowed by the moon goddess herself, only upon those destined to rule. A mark that was an exact mirror of the one Ilarion himself bore upon his own arm. A collective gasp went through the room, sharp and horrified. The whispers ceased. The growls died. There was only the crackle of the torches and the sudden, frantic pounding of Seraphine's own heart. Ilarion rose from his throne. He did not stand so much as unfold, a creature of breathtaking size and power. He descended the dais in 2 silent strides, his movements imbued with a predatory grace that sent a primal shiver of fear down her spine. The court parted before him like water before the bow of a warship. He stopped a mere foot from her, and Seraphine was forced to crane her neck to look up at him. He was a mountain of muscle and fury, and his scent overwhelmed her, a storm of ozone, ancient forest, and cold, hard rage. He did not speak. He simply reached out, his large, calloused hand engulfing her arm. His touch was not gentle. It was a brand of searing heat, a shock that jolted through her entire body. His fingers were tight, possessive, as his thumb brushed over the silver mark. His eyes were fixed on it, the golden fire within them blazing with a terrifying intensity. He recognized it. He had to. It was the undeniable truth of her claim. She saw the flicker of recognition, the dawning horror, the violent conflict warring in his expression. His jaw clenched, the muscles in his neck cording. She was his father's child, his sister, his blood. But then something else happened. He went utterly still, his head tilting a fraction of an inch. His nostrils flared. He was scenting her, not as a king inspecting a subject, but as a wolf. His burning gaze lifted from the mark on her arm and slammed into hers. His pupils dilated, swallowing the gold until his eyes were 2 pools of black night. A growl ripped from his throat, a sound so guttural, so feral and broken, it was nothing like the commanding rumbles from before. This was a sound of pure, agonized instinct. It was not the sound of a king discovering a half-sister. It was the sound of a wolf recognizing something far more sacred and far more profane. The bond, dormant her entire life, slammed into her consciousness with the force of a physical blow. It was a lightning strike to her soul, an invisible, unbreakable tether that snapped taut between them, vibrating with an impossible energy. She felt it, a dizzying, terrifying pull toward him, an echo of his own shock, his own rage, and something else. A dark, possessive hunger that terrified her more than anything. His grip on her arm tightened until she thought the bone might splinter. He stared at her, his face a mask of disbelief and self-loathing. The truth was there, in the way his wolf clawed at the surface of his control, in the way the air between them crackled with a forbidden power. She was his father's daughter, and by some cruel, blasphemous twist of fate, the moon had marked her as his mate. He recoiled as if burned, shoving her away from him. She stumbled back, catching herself before she fell. The entire court was frozen, watching, sensing the shift in the air, the primal energy that had just ecloded from their king. Alarion's chest was heaving, his hands clenched into fists so tight his knuckles were white. He looked at her not as kin, not as a mate, but as an abomination, a curse, a weakness he could not afford. Impossible, he breathed. The word a ragged tear in the silence. Then his eyes blazed with cold, absolute fury. He threw his head back and roared, a sound of pure, unrestrained power that shook the very foundations of the keep. "Guards!" His voice cracked through the hall like a whip. "Seize her, take this thing to the dungeons. Put her in the deepest cell in silver chains. I will deal with her myself." The guards' hands were like iron brands on her arms, hauling her from the throne room without a shred of ceremony. The warmth and light vanished, swallowed by a descending stone staircase that spiraled into the guts of the mountain. The air grew cold, thick with the metallic tang of old blood and the damp, earthy smell of perpetual darkness. Drips of water echoed in the oppressive silence, a morbid clock ticking away the seconds of her new, wretched life. Her feet stumbled on the uneven steps, but the guards did not slow, their grip relentless. They were dragging her to a tomb. They stopped before a heavy, iron-banded door, its surface slick with moisture. One of the guards produced a great rusted key and turned it in the lock. The screech of the mechanism was a sound of absolute finality. He shoved her inside and she fell to her knees on a floor of rough-hewn stone and damp, musty straw. The cell was a black maw, devoid of light. The only sound was her own ragged breathing and the clinking of chains. A guard entered behind her, a torch in his hand, casting flickering, monstrous shadows on the walls. He brought with him a set of manacles, their surface gleaming with a dull, malevolent silver. "King's orders," he grunted, yanking her arm. Seraphine didn't resist. She was numb, the shock of the past hour having frozen the blood in her veins. He clamped the first silver cuff around her wrist. A searing, unnatural cold shot up her arm, a pain so sharp and alien it ripped a gasp from her throat. It felt like ice and fire combined, a poison that sank directly into her blood, making her feel weak, nauseous, disconnected from herself. The guard paid her no mind, fastening the second cuff and attaching the heavy central chain to a ring bolted into the stone wall. He stood looking down at her with undisguised contempt. "Blasphemy, claiming the blood of the king. The Alpha will make you pay for that lie." He spat on the floor near her feet and then left, the torchlight receding with him. The heavy door slammed shut, the bolt shooting home with a deafening thud. Darkness, absolute and complete. The cold from the silver seeped through her, a creeping paralysis that was more than just physical. It felt like it was trying to extinguish the very spark of her soul. She huddled against the wall, the stone biting into her back, and wrapped her arms around herself. The bond, that terrifying, invisible thing that had exploded between them, was a dull, agonizing ache in the center of her chest, a phantom limb that had been brutally severed. He called her a thing, an abomination. He had looked at her with such pure, undiluted hatred. Her mother had promised her sanctuary, a brother's protection. Instead, she had found a monster, a king who looked at her and saw only a curse. And the most terrifying part? Some deep, forgotten part of her had recognized him, not as a brother, but as the other half of a song she never knew she was singing. That recognition was a madness she couldn't afford to entertain. Not here, not in chains. Upstairs, in the king's solar, the silence was a coiled serpent. Ilarion stared into the heart of a roaring fire, a crystal tumbler of amber liquid held tight in his fist. He had not tasted it. The scent of her, wild heather, rain-washed earth, and a fragile humanity that drove his wolf into a frenzy, still clung to the air, to his skin, an invisible stain he couldn't wash away. He had felt the snap of the bond like a fissure in his own soul. For an instant, every instinct, every fiber of his being had screamed one undeniable word: mine. The urge to drag her from the hall, to hide her away, to cover her in his scent, and tear apart anyone who looked at her had been so overwhelming it had almost broken him. His roar had not just been one of rage, but of pure primal terror. The moon had given him a mate, and she was his father's bastard, his sister. The door creaked open. Only one person in the keep would dare enter without being summoned. "You should not have sent her to the dungeons," a calm voice stated. Ilarion didn't turn. "She is a liar, Malachi, a charlatan seeking power." An old wolf, his face a roadmap of scars and wisdom, stepped into the firelight. Malachi was the elder of the Blackwood pack, the keeper of their laws and lore, and the only one who had ever been able to temper Ilarion's fury. He had served Ilarion's father before him. "A liar with the royal mark burned into her skin by the goddess herself?" Malachi countered, his voice gentle but firm. "I saw it, my king, as did the entire court. It is genuine." "Then it is a trick. Dark magic," Ilarion snarled, finally turning. His golden eyes were wild, banked fires of torment. "My father would not. He would not have sired a child on a human." "Theron was a man of great appetites and greater secrets," Malachi said softly, his gaze filled with a pity that Ilarion hated. "We both know that. But the mark is only half of the issue, isn't it, Ilarion?" Ilarion's jaw tightened. He knew what the old wolf was asking. Malachi had been close enough to see it in his king's eyes, to feel the cataclysmic shift in the room's energy. "Do not speak of it." "It must be spoken of," Malachi insisted, taking a step closer. "The bond of the fated mate is a sacred law, a gift from the moon. It cannot be ignored. It cannot be denied without dire consequences for you, for the pack, for the entire kingdom." "It is blasphemy!" Ilarion slammed his tumbler down on the heavy oak table, the crystal cracking under the force. The liquid spilled like blood. "She is my blood, my half-sister. The moon would not decree such a thing. It is a perversion." "The goddess's will is not for us to question," Malachi said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "There are prophecies, old texts that speak of a bond that would reforge a broken line, of a union of forbidden blood that would heal the curse laid upon your lineage." Ilarion scoffed, a harsh, bitter sound. "The ramblings of mad seers. My duty is to the law, and the law forbids this. She is an abomination, a weakness sent to destroy me. I will not allow it." "And how will you stop it?" Malachi asked, his old eyes piercing. "The bond is not a choice. It is a fact. It is now a part of you. The farther you push her away, the more it will tear you apart. Your wolf will fight you. It will tear its way out of your skin to get to her. You know this. I can see the war in you already." Malachi was right. The wolf inside him was a caged beast, clawing at the bars of his control, howling her name. Every instinct screamed to go to her, to protect her, to claim her. The thought of her in the cold dark, in silver that would burn even her diluted bloodline, was a physical agony. "Leave me," Ilarion commanded, his voice a low growl of finality. Malachi bowed his head. "As you wish, my king, but remember, a chain can be broken from either end. You may think you are caging her, but you have also just caged yourself." The elder departed, leaving Ilarion alone with the fire and the howling tempest in his soul. He stood there for an hour, unmoving, fighting a war within himself that threatened to shatter his sanity. The king demanded her execution for treason and blasphemy. The wolf demanded her release and her safety. It was an impossible, agonizing paradox. And with every passing second, the pull grew stronger, a maddening thrum beneath his skin. He could not bear it. With a curse that was half prayer, half damnation, he strode from the room, his long, powerful strides eating up the distance to the dungeons. He needed to see her again. He needed to face this curse, to look it in the eye and prove to himself he could conquer it. He would break her, he would force her to confess her lies, and then he would be free. The guards at the dungeon entrance snapped to attention, their eyes wide with fear as their king descended, his face a mask of thunderous fury. He waved them aside, taking a torch from the wall and plunging into the darkness alone. Seraphine heard the footsteps long before the light appeared. They were heavy, measured, and purposeful. They resonated through the stone floor, vibrating in her bones. She knew who it was. The dull ache of the bond in her chest sharpened into a blade of excruciating anticipation. The torchlight flooded the corridor, and his silhouette filled the barred window of her cell door. The key turned, the lock screamed, and he was inside, plunging her small world into a vortex of firelight, shadow, and overwhelming power. He was a primal god of wrath, his scent of storm and pine filling the cramped space, suffocating her. He said nothing. He circled her slowly, his eyes burning into her, cataloging her huddled form, the straw in her hair, the raw fear in her eyes, and the silver chains on her wrists. He stopped in front of her so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. "Who sent you?" he demanded, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "Was it the Fae, the Southern Lords? Who paid you to orchestrate this elaborate lie?" "No one sent me," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "It is the truth." "Do not lie to me," he roared, and the very stones seemed to tremble. "My father was a king. He would not have dirtied himself with a human." The insult to her mother was a spark on dry tinder. A flicker of defiance broke through her fear. "He loved her," she said, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "More than he ever loved his cold queen. He told her so. He promised he would come for us." Alarian's face contorted in a sneer of disgust. "Love, a human's weakness, it proves nothing." He crouched down before her, bringing his face level with hers. The intensity of his gaze was a physical weight. "Tell me your name again." "Seraphine?" He tested the name on his tongue, the sound a soft, hateful caress. "Seraphine, a name for an angel, how ironic." He reached out, his fingers brushing a stray lock of hair from her cheek. The touch was electric, a jolt of pure energy that made her flinch. The bond between them flared, a sudden, blinding pulse of heat and raw, possessive need. His eyes widened, his pupils blowing out until they were nearly black. He felt it too. He snatched his hand back as if her skin had burned him. He rose to his full height, pacing the small cell like a caged tiger. "This feeling, it is a trick," he snarled, more to himself than to her. "A glamour you have woven." "I don't know what you're talking about," she cried, shaking her head. The silver cuffs bit into her wrists, sending fresh waves of icy pain through her. "I don't know what this is, I only know what my mother told me, that you were my blood, that you would protect me." He stopped, his back to her. His shoulders were rigid with tension. "Protection is the last thing you will find here." He turned, and in his eyes she saw the wolf, raw and barely restrained. He lunged forward, not to strike her, but to grip her arm, his fingers wrapping around her wrist, just above the silver manacle. His thumb pressed hard against her pulse point, as if trying to feel the truth in her very blood. The moment his skin touched hers, the bond ignited. But this time, it was different. It was a two-way street. A wave of agony, not her own, crashed into her. His torment, his rage, his self-loathing, and in that same instant, her own pain from the silver, amplified by his touch, shot through the connection and slammed directly into him. Alarian let out a strangled cry, a sound of guttural shock and pain. His eyes flew wide as he felt a phantom, searing cold lance up his own arm, an echo of the silver burning her. His wolf, the alpha, the protector hardwired into his soul, reacted with mindless, instantaneous fury. It did not see a sister, a liar, or a political problem. It saw its mate in pain, and its response was absolute. A feral snarl ripped from his throat, a sound that was not human. His eyes bled from gold to burning amber. With a movement too fast for her to follow, he seized the heavy silver chain connecting her manacles. Muscles bulged in his arms and back, and with a guttural roar of pure, untempered power, he tore the chain apart. The links of solid silver shattered, flying across the cell like shrapnel. Silence. heavy and breathless. Seraphine stared at the broken chain, then at him. He was breathing hard, his chest heaving, his eyes wild with what looked like horror. He looked down at his own hands, then at her, as if he couldn't comprehend what he had just done. He had acted on pure instinct. An instinct to protect her, to free her from pain. An instinct that defied every command of his rational mind. He took a stumbling step back, away from her, the firelight catching the utter shock and self-disgust on his face. The king had just been violently overthrown by the wolf. "What?" he whispered, his voice ragged with disbelief and a terrifying dawning dread. "Have you done to me?" The echo of shattering silver hung in the air, a testament to the war he had just lost against himself. Ilarion stared at her, not as a king, but as a man who had just seen the beast within him tear through its leash, and he looked terrified. The broken chain lay between them, a symbol of his undone will. The raw, animalistic power that had flooded the cell receded, leaving a vacuum of tense, horrified silence. He looked from her freed wrists to his own hands, then back to her face, his expression a maelstrom of confusion, fury, and a flicker of something she dared not name. "Get up," he commanded, his voice a harsh rasp. The king was wrestling back control, shoving the wolf back into its cage. Seraphine scrambled to her feet, her legs unsteady. The lingering cold of the silver still pulsed in her veins, but the acute burning pain was gone. The heavy cuffs, no longer chained to the wall, felt like dead weights on her arms. He didn't move to remove them. This was not a rescue. It was an relocation. He turned and strode out of the cell without a backward glance, the torch in his hand casting his long, predatory shadow ahead of him. "Follow." It wasn't a request. She hurried to obey, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She was out of the dungeon, but she was no less his prisoner. They ascended the winding stairs, leaving the scent of damp and despair behind, and emerged into the keep's lower levels. The guards they passed flattened themselves against the walls, their heads bowed, their eyes averted from the sight of their king, followed by the chained human girl. No one dared to question him. His fury was a palpable storm front that preceded him. He led her through a labyrinth of stone corridors, up another flight of stairs reserved for the royal wing, and down a hall lined with tapestries depicting glorious hunts and ancient battles. He stopped before a heavy, iron-strapped door and pushed it open, gesturing for her to enter. Seraphine stepped inside and stopped, her breath catching in her throat. This was no cell, it was a lavishly appointed bedchamber. A fire crackled in a great stone hearth, casting a warm golden glow over the room. A massive bed, piled high with furs, dominated one wall. Rich carpets covered the floor, and a polished wooden table stood near a window that looked out over the moonlit forest. A tray of food, bread, cheese, and roasted meat, sat on the table, along with a pitcher of water. It was a cage, but it was a gilded one. "You will stay here," Ilarion said from the doorway, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "You will not leave this room. You will not speak to anyone. Guards will be posted outside. Do you understand?" She nodded, unable to find her voice. She was overwhelmed by the sudden shift from a cold, dark hole to this suffocating luxury. What did it mean? Why bring her here? He took a step into the room, his presence immediately shrinking the space. He watched her, his eyes narrowed, still trying to solve the impossible puzzle she presented. "The silver, it caused you pain." It was not a question, but a statement of fact. A memory of a sensation he had felt himself. "Yes," she whispered. "Why?" he pressed. "It should not harm a human." "I don't know," she answered honestly. "I only know that I am my father's daughter. Perhaps that is enough." His jaw clenched. The reminder of their shared blood was a knife he clearly did not want twisted. He looked at the silver cuffs still encircling her wrists, a muscle working in his cheek. His wolf, the part of him that had shattered her chains, bristled at the sight of them. The king, the cold, calculating ruler, saw them as a necessary precaution. "A key will be brought for those," he said, gesturing vaguely at the manacles. His gaze lingered on them for a second too long, a flicker of that same internal conflict flashing in his eyes. "Do not think this is kindness. You are my prisoner. I have brought you here because the dungeons are unsuitable, for now. But your fate is yet undecided." He turned to leave, his hand on the heavy door. "Why did you do it?" Seraphine asked, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. Down there. Why did you break the chain? He froze, his back to her. She saw the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand tightened on the iron door handle until his knuckles were white. For a long moment, he didn't answer. He was a king who never had to explain his actions, who ruled by decree and absolute power. But her question was not one of politics. It was something far more personal, and it struck at the heart of the battle raging within him. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, dangerous whisper that chilled her more than the dungeon's cold. My wolf is volatile, unpredictable. It mistook your weakness for something that needed protecting. It was an instinct, nothing more. Do not make the mistake of reading meaning into the actions of a beast. And with that, he was gone, the door shutting behind him with a heavy final thud. The sound of a bolt being shot home echoed from the other side. She was alone. Seraphine stood in the center of the opulent room, trembling. An instinct. Nothing more. He was lying. To her and to himself. She had felt it through the bond. It wasn't just a blind instinct. It was a possessive, furious, targeted rage for her. The wolf had recognized her as his mate, and it had acted to defend her from a threat, even when the threat had been an order issued by its own human half. She sank onto the edge of the plush bed, the furs soft beneath her. The warmth of the fire was a welcome balm to her chilled skin. She looked down at the hateful silver cuffs. He was having a key brought. A part of her was relieved, but another, more pragmatic part, knew this was not a reprieve. He was moving her from a physical prison to a psychological one. Here, she was a constant reminder to him of the blasphemous bond that tied them together. Here, he could watch her, study her, and try to unravel the curse she represented. A short time later, there was a sharp rap on the door. It opened just enough for a grim-faced guard to slide a small, ornate iron key onto the floor. He did not look at her. He did not speak. He simply slid it in and shut the door, the bolt ramming home again. With fumbling fingers, Seraphine retrieved the key. It fit perfectly into the small locks on the cuffs. With a soft click, the first one sprang open. She rubbed her wrist, the skin red and raw beneath. The feeling of freedom was immense. She unlocked the other, and the heavy silver bracelets clattered onto the floor. She kicked them under the bed, wanting them out of her sight. She was ravenous. She went to the table and tore off a piece of bread, devouring it, then the cheese, then the meat. She drank the water like a woman who had just crossed a desert. The simple act of eating, of feeling her strength return, grounded her. When she was finished, she felt more human. Her gaze was drawn to the window. It was made of thick, leaded glass panes, but it was not barred. She crossed the room and looked out. Her chamber was high up in the central tower, overlooking the vast, dark expanse of the Blackwood. The forest stretched as far as the eye could see, a sea of shadows under a fat silver moon. The sheer wildness of it called to a part of her she didn't understand. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass. She was a bird in a beautiful cage, and the whole world was just outside, free and untamed. Down in the great hall, the pack elders had gathered. The whispers from the throne room had spread like wildfire, and now the scent of fear and uncertainty was thick in the air. They sat around a massive round table, the flickering candlelight carving deep shadows into their weathered faces. Ilarion stood at the head of the table, his arms crossed over his massive chest, his expression like a thundercloud. "You saw the mark," he stated, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Malachi confirms it is genuine, and she claims to be my father's daughter." An old scarred wolf named Gaiden, the pack's war master, slammed his fist on the table. "It is a ploy. The southern lords grow bold. They send this human witch to sow discord among us, to weaken you with a fabricated scandal." "And the bond?" Malachi interjected calmly from his seat beside Ilarion. "Did the southern lords fabricate that as well, Gaiden? Did you not feel the power that erupted from your king? It was the mate bond, undeniable and absolute." A nervous murmur went through the elders. They had all felt it, a shockwave of raw, possessive energy that had emanated from their alpha. It was a sacred, primal force they all recognized. "Blasphemy," Gaiden spat, though his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "To be bonded to his own sister. It is a curse, a stain on the vein line. The old laws are clear. Such a union is forbidden, an abomination in the eyes of the moon. The laws also state that the fated bond is the highest law of all, Malachi countered. It supersedes all others. To deny it is to invite the wrath of the goddess. It can lead to madness, to the decay of the Alpha's power, and the eventual collapse of the pack. The room fell silent, the weight of their dilemma pressing down on them. They were caught between two sacred, unbreakable laws that were in direct opposition. "What would you have me do?" Alarion's voice was a low, dangerous growl. He looked from face to face, challenging them. "Embrace her? Take my father's bastard, my sister, as my mate? Announce to the kingdom that their king is bound to a cursed union? We would have a civil war on our hands before the next full moon." "Kill her," Gaiden said bluntly. "It is the only way. End the abomination before it can take root. Sever the connection. It will be painful for you, my king. But the pack's survival must come first." Alarion's wolf let out a silent, vicious snarl at the suggestion. The thought of harming her, of ending her life, sent a wave of protective fury through him, so strong it was all he could do not to lunge across the table and rip the War Master's throat out. He fought it down, his hands clenching into fists. "No," he said, the word coming out colder and harder than he intended. Gaiden's eyes widened slightly in surprise. "My king? She will not be harmed," Alarion repeated, his voice dropping to a near whisper, yet carrying more menace than a shout. "She is a prisoner of the crown. I will discover the truth of her origins, and I will deal with her. But no one," he swept his burning gaze across every elder at the table, "is to lay a hand on her. That is my final word." He turned on his heel and strode from the room, leaving his council in stunned silence. He had just defended her. He had claimed sole authority over her fate and forbidden any harm to come to her. He had chosen the wolf's instinct over the pack's logic. And every elder in that room knew, with a dawning sense of dread, that their king was already compromised. The weakness had already taken root. He didn't go back to his own chambers. He couldn't. He found himself walking the silent corridors, his steps inevitably leading him back to the hallway outside her room. The two guards stationed there stiffened as he approached, their fists going to their hearts in salute. He dismissed them with a sharp wave of his hand. He stood before her door, listening. He couldn't hear anything, but he could feel her. Her presence was a quiet, steady thrum on the other side of the wood, a magnetic pull on his very soul. He closed his eyes, his forehead resting against the cool, rough-hewn oak. Her scent, faint but unmistakable, clung to the air. Heather and rain, innocence and storm, his. He was losing. The king, the Alpha, the ruler of the strongest kingdom in the north, was being brought to his knees by a slip of a girl in a locked room. He hated her for it. He hated his father for the sin that created her. He hated the moon for this cruel, impossible fate. And somewhere deep in the most feral corner of his heart, a terrifying, possessive craving was growing. A craving to throw open the door, to go to her, to erase the scent of fear that clung to her and replace it with his own. He wanted to see her in his bed, wrapped in his furs, wearing his mark. The thought was so vivid, so powerful, it sent a tremor through his entire body. He recoiled from the door as if it were white-hot, a harsh, guttural sound of self-loathing catching in his throat. He turned and fled, not walking but stalking down the hall, the beast inside him pacing the confines of his soul, roaring for a mate it could never, ever have. 3 days passed, 3 cycles of sun and moon viewed through the same leaded glass window. For Seraphine, time had flattened into a meaningless loop. A tray of food would appear through the door, left by a silent guard. The fire would be stoked by a servant who refused to meet her eyes. She was fed, she was warm, she was clean. There was a small chamber adjoining with a basin and fresh water, but she was utterly, terrifyingly alone. The silence was a living thing, pressing in on her, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the frantic beating of her own heart. The bond was a constant, low hum beneath the surface of her thoughts. It was no longer the sharp, agonizing pull of the throne room, but a persistent awareness of him. It was a phantom presence in the room, a background radiation that spiked whenever his footsteps echoed in the distant corridors of the keep. She knew with a certainty that defied logic when he was near the tower and when he was far away. She could feel the turbulent storm of his emotions, a constant simmering rage banked over a deep well of conflict. He was a tempest held barely in check, and she was the eye of his storm. She spent her time pacing the confines of her cage, from the window overlooking the endless forest to the heavy bolted door. She traced the patterns in the tapestries, her fingers lingering on the woven images of wolves running free under a silver moon. The irony was a bitter taste in her mouth. Her mother had spoken of a birthright, of family and belonging. She had found only a gilded prison and a brother king who looked at her with the same horror he might reserve for a venomous snake. Was this her destiny? To live and die in this room, a secret shame locked away from the world? On the fourth day, the servant girl who brought her morning meal did something different. She was young, with wide, frightened eyes and hair the color of straw. She had never spoken, never even looked at Seraphine directly. But today, after setting the tray on the table, she hesitated at the door. Her hands were twisting in the fabric of her apron. "Is there something wrong?" Seraphine asked, her own voice startling her. It sounded rusty from disuse. The girl jumped, her eyes darting to the door as if expecting a guard to burst in. She gave a tiny, frantic shake of her head. But she didn't leave. She reached into a deep pocket in her skirt and pulled out something small and flat, wrapped in a piece of cloth. She scurried forward, placed it on the far corner of the bed, and then backed away, her movements bird-like and terrified. "They are saying things," the girl whispered. The words a frightened rush of air. "In the halls, in the kitchens. War Master Gaiden says you are a human witch, that you've cast a spell on the king." Seraphine's heart went cold. "A spell?" "The bond," the girl breathed, her eyes wide with a mixture of awe and terror. "They call it the abomination bond. They say it is a curse that will destroy the pack. War Master Gaiden says the only cure is your death." The word hung in the air between them, ugly and final. So the pack wanted her dead. Alarion was the only thing standing between her and a summary execution. And he hated the very sight of her. It was a fragile shield, at best. "Why are you telling me this?" Seraphine asked, her voice barely a whisper. The girl looked at her, truly looked at her for the first time. A flicker of compassion crossed her fearful features. "My mother was an outsider too. Not human, but from the southern packs. They never let her forget it." She gestured to the object on the bed. "It is not much, just a book of old tales. I thought the silence might be the worst part." Before Seraphine could thank her, the girl, whose name she didn't even know, scurried from the room. The bolt slammed home, leaving Seraphine with a piece of bread, a death sentence, and the first act of kindness she had received since she'd arrived. She unwrapped the book. It was small and leather-bound, its pages worn soft with age. It was a collection of children's stories, myths of the moon goddess, and the first wolves. It was a lifeline. Meanwhile, in the training yard below, the clang of steel on steel was the only music Alarion allowed himself. He moved with brutal efficiency, a blur of muscle and fury, his massive greatsword a silver extension of his will. He fought 3 of his best warriors at once, driving them back with a relentless, punishing assault. Sweat dripped from his brow, stinging the old scar above his eye. The coppery scent of a shallow cut on his arm filled the air. He was trying to beat the wolf into submission, to exhaust the beast that clawed at him every night, that howled her name in his dreams. It wasn't working. He disarmed the last of his opponents with a flick of his wrist that sent the man's sword spinning into the dirt and slammed the flat of his own blade against the man's chest, sending him sprawling. "Again," Alarion growled, his chest heaving. Malachi, who had been watching from the shadows of the armory, stepped into the light. "That is enough, my king. You will kill them if you continue." Alarion turned his fiery gaze on the elder. "Then they are weak." "They are loyal," Malachi corrected gently. "And you are trying to fight a war on this field that can only be fought within yourself. The bond is not a foe you can best with a sword." "Gaiden thinks it can be bested with an executioner's axe," Alarion snarled, slamming his sword point down into the hard-packed earth. He wiped the sweat from his face with the back of his leather gauntlet. He gained support. "I can feel the dissent growing in the pack. They see my hesitation to deal with her as weakness." "They see a king at war with his own soul," Malachi said. "They are afraid because their alpha is unbalanced. You avoid her. You do not eat. You do not sleep. The bond is a chain between 2 souls, Alarion. When you starve her of contact, you starve yourself. The wolf within you is growing desperate. It is a dangerous state for an alpha. Just then, War Master Gaiden strode into the yard, his face a mask of grim satisfaction. He bowed stiffly to Ilarion. "My king, a word, if I may." "Speak," Ilarion bit out. "The human witch has begun to spread her influence," Gaiden said, his voice laced with contempt. "She has charmed one of the serving staff, a girl named Elspeth. The girl has been smuggling items to the prisoner." Ilarion went very still. Malachi shot a warning look at Gaiden, but the War Master ignored it. "What items?" Ilarion's voice was deceptively calm, a low rumble that promised violence. "A book, my king, trivial perhaps, but it is a breach of your orders. A sign that the witch's poison is already seeping through the cracks of this keep. The girl has been taken for questioning. I await your command on how to proceed with her punishment." The world narrowed to a single point of incandescent rage in Ilarion's mind. Punishment. For a book. For an act of kindness toward her. The wolf rose up, not with the agonized confusion of before, but with a clear, sharp, possessive fury. The girl was under his protection because she had aided his mate. Gaiden had dared to touch what belonged to him. He did not speak. He yanked his sword from the ground and strode from the training yard, his black cloak billowing behind him like a storm cloud. Malachi and Gaiden exchanged a look, one of deep concern, the other of grim triumph, and followed in his wake. Seraphine was sitting by the fire, utterly engrossed in the Book of Myths, when the door to her chamber was thrown open with such force that it slammed against the stone wall, the sound like a crack of thunder. Ilarion filled the doorway, a terrifying vision of wrath. His hair was damp with sweat, a fresh cut bled freely on his arm, and his eyes were blazing coals. He was breathing heavily, and the scent of his rage, of sweat and blood and pure, undiluted power, flooded the room. She leaped to her feet, the book falling from her lap. "What did you do?" he roared, stalking into the room. He was the beast unbound, the king's control shattered. I did nothing," she stammered, backing away until the cold stone of the hearth was at her back. "Lies!" He was in front of her in 2 strides, his sheer size and fury pinning her in place. "You have a servant girl under your spell. She brings you gifts. You are whispering your poison into the ears of my people, turning my own keep against me." "No, she was just kind," Seraphine pleaded, her heart hammering against her ribs. "She brought me a book, that is all." "Kindness is a weapon in the hands of a deceiver," he snarled. He braced his hands on the stone mantle on either side of her head, caging her in. His face was inches from hers. She could see the flecks of gold in the inferno of his eyes, feel the heat of his body, smell the primal scent of the wolf that was so close to the surface. The bond between them flared, a dizzying, intoxicating wave of heat and recognition that stole her breath. "She will be punished for her treason," he bit out, his voice a low, guttural threat. But his eyes were locked on hers, and the fury in them was warring with a dark, desperate hunger. He was too close. The scent of her, of heather and rain and something uniquely hers, was wrapping around him, sinking into him, calming the frantic beast, even as it inflamed the man. "Punish me instead," she said, her voice shaking, but clear. "She did nothing wrong. It was my fault. I asked her for it." It was a lie, but she would not let that girl suffer for a moment of compassion. His expression flickered. Her willingness to sacrifice herself for a stranger was not the action of a manipulative witch. It was noble, and it confused him, which only fueled his anger. "Do you have any idea what you have done?" he whispered, his voice dropping, becoming more dangerous than his roar. "You have fractured my counsel. You have sown dissent in my pack. You have awakened a thing inside of me that I have spent my entire life learning to control. You are a plague in my house, a weakness in my blood." His hand came up, not to strike her, but to cup her jaw. His thumb brushed against her skin, a touch that was both rough and searingly gentle. The contact was a lightning strike. The world fell away, and there was only the overwhelming reality of the bond, a living current of energy flowing between them. She saw through his rage to the agonizing conflict beneath, the profound loneliness of a king, the desperate craving of a wolf for its mate, the terror of a man facing an impossible destiny. And he saw her, not the witch, not the sister, not the problem, but the woman. He saw the terror in her eyes, but beneath it, a core of strength that called to his own. He saw the loneliness that mirrored his. His thumb traced the line of her lips, and his eyes darkened, his pupils dilating. The wolf was winning. The urge to lower his head, to close the last impossible inch between them, to taste her, to claim her, was a physical force, a tidal wave that was about to crest and break. "My king!" The voice was a shard of ice, shattering the moment. They both started, pulling apart as if burned. Malachi stood in the open doorway, his face pale, his breathing ragged, as if he had run all the way from the dungeons. He was holding a dusty ancient scroll in his trembling hands. Gaiden stood just behind him, his face a mask of stone. "Malachi, what is the meaning of this?" Ilarion growled, his voice thick with the frustrated desire he was trying to force back down. He did not move away from Seraphine, still standing before her like a shield. The old elder took a step into the room, his eyes wide, flicking from his king to the human girl and back again. "The old law," he breathed, holding up the scroll. "I have been in the archive since you brought her here. I have been reading the forbidden texts, the prophecies from before the schism." "And?" Ilarion demanded, his patience gone. Malachi looked at Seraphine, then back to his king, his expression one of profound dread and awe. "It is not a curse, my king, or rather, it is the cure to one. The prophecy speaks of it. When the royal blood thins, when a king's sin creates a daughter of two worlds, wolf and human, she will not be his weakness." Malachi's voice dropped to a whisper that filled the suddenly silent room. "She will be his sacrifice." The word was not spoken. It was dropped into the room like a shard of ice, instantly freezing the heated air. It hung between them, obscene and glittering, refracting the firelight into 1,000 terrible possibilities. Seraphine felt it land in the pit of her stomach, a cold, heavy stone of dread. She was not a sister, not a mate, not even a person. She was a resource to be consumed, a ritual offering. Ilarion recoiled as if he'd been struck. The predatory hunger in his eyes was instantly extinguished, replaced by a flash of raw, violent disbelief. He took an involuntary step back from her, the space between them suddenly a gaping chasm. Only Gaiden's expression changed for the better. The grim line of his mouth softened, and a fanatical light sparked in his eyes. He saw not a tragedy, but a solution, a wholly ordained path out of the blasphemy he so despised. "Explain," Ilarion commanded, his voice a low, dangerous growl aimed at Malachi. He did not, Seraphine noticed, move from his position in front of her. He was still a shield, even if he was a shield of horrified rage. Malachi's hands trembled as he unrolled the ancient scroll further. The parchment was brittle, the ink faded to the color of old blood. "The vein line has long carried a shadow, my king, a fire in the blood that burns hotter with each generation. Our alphas grow more powerful, but also more volatile. The scroll calls it the sliver of ruin, a splinter from the first wolf's rage that was embedded in your ancestor's soul. It has been passed down, father to son, growing stronger, thinning the bloodline's connection to the moon's temperance." He looked at Ilarion, his old eyes filled with a sorrowful understanding. "This rage, this curse, it is why your father had such appetites. It is why you fight a constant war within yourself. The prophecy states that when the line is on the verge of being consumed by this inner fire, a daughter will be born of two worlds, a child of the Alpha's blood and a human soul. She will carry the mark, but her blood will be a perfect balance of wolf's fire and human calm." Gaiden stepped forward, his voice ringing with righteous conviction. "She is the key. Her blood is the cure." "What must be done?" Ilarion asked, his face carved from stone. He did not look at Seraphine, but she could feel the tension radiating from him, a physical force that made the air thick and hard to breathe. "The ritual of cleansing," Malachi read, his voice barely a whisper. "On the night of the blood moon, when the sky is shadowed and the veil between worlds is thin, the daughter must be taken to the Heartstone altar, deep within the forest. There, her blood must be given willingly." "Given?" Gaiden scoffed, a cruel, sharp sound. "The text uses a gentler word than is required. Her life must be given. Her heart's blood spilled upon the stone will purge the sliver of ruin from the vein line forever. It will restore the balance. It will save our pack, our king, from the madness that has haunted his family for centuries." He looked directly at Ilarion, his gaze hard as iron. "It is the will of the goddess. It is your sacred duty." Seraphine's knees felt weak. She pressed a hand against the stone mantle to steady herself. They were discussing her death, calmly, rationally, as if she were a problematic sheep to be culled for the good of the flock. A cold, fierce anger, born of sheer terror, began to uncoil within her. It was a feeling she had suppressed her entire life, the fury of the powerless. "Do I have a voice in this?" The words were quiet, but they cut through the room's tense atmosphere like a knife. All three wolves turned to look at her, Gaiden with contempt, Malachi with pity, and Ilarion. Ilarion's expression was unreadable, a mask of torment. "My life," she said, her voice gaining strength as the anger burned away the fear, "is not a tool for you to use. My blood is not a potion to cure your king's temper. I am a person." "You are a means to an end," Gaiden said dismissively. "A vessel created by the goddess for a single glorious purpose. You should be honored." "Honored to be your sacrifice?" she shot back, her chin lifting. "I came here seeking a family, a home, not an altar." She looked past the two elders, her gaze locking with Ilarion's. She appealed to the one person whose will mattered, the one person who was bound to her by a force more ancient than any prophecy. "You cannot possibly believe this is right." It was the question that hung in the balance, the fulcrum upon which their entire world was about to pivot. Ilarion stood frozen, caught in an impossible trap. The king in him heard the logic. The cure for his inner rage, the salvation of his bloodline, the unification of his pack. All of it could be bought with the life of one girl. A girl who was a political nightmare, a social pariah, a living symbol of his father's greatest sin. Duty, reason, and the brutal calculus of leadership all pointed toward the altar. But the wolf was screaming. It was a silent, soul-shredding howl of denial. The beast inside him cared nothing for bloodlines or prophecies. It knew only one truth, a truth written in scent and soul-deep recognition. Mine. The thought of her blood spilling on cold stone, of her life being extinguished, was not a solution. It was an extinction-level event. It was a visceral, physical agony that twisted in his gut. He had felt a phantom echo of her pain from the silver chains. What would her death feel like? It would not just break the bond, it would shatter his soul. He would not be cleansed. He would be annihilated. He finally moved. He turned his head slowly and fixed his burning gaze on his war master. "The prophecy says the blood must be given willingly," he stated, his voice a low, rumbling threat. Gaiden did not flinch. Willingness can be encouraged. For the good of the pack, for the stability of the throne, any price is worth paying. "You know this, my king. You have made harder choices to protect this kingdom." "Have I?" Ilarion took a step toward Gaiden, away from Seraphine, and the entire energy of the room shifted. The king was no longer a judge, listening to arguments. He was a predator, stalking his prey. "Have I ever ordered the ritual murder of an unarmed woman in my custody, based on a 1,000-year-old scroll found in a dusty cellar?" "She is not a woman, she is a sacrifice," Gaiden insisted, standing his ground, but a flicker of uncertainty entered his eyes. He had misjudged his king's reaction. "She has a name," Ilarion snarled, getting closer, his superior height and bulk forcing Gaiden to crane his neck. "Her name is Seraphine, and she is under my protection." The declaration was absolute. It was a line drawn in blood and fire. He had made his choice, not the king, not the alpha weighing the needs of his pack, but the wolf, the mate, refusing to allow a threat to the one thing it valued above all else. Gaiden's face paled, then flushed with anger. "Protection? You would protect the source of the curse over its cure? You would choose this half-breed abomination over the health of your pack? Your own sanity?" "Watch your tongue, Gaiden," Ilarion whispered, his voice lethally soft. "You are speaking of the woman my father sired. You are speaking of my blood, and you will show her the respect that blood is due, or I will strip the rank from your shoulders and the skin from your bones." The threat was so raw, so full of violent promise, that even Malachi took a half-step back. Gaiden paled, his throat working. He had never been spoken to this way. He was the war master, second only to the alpha in matters of war, but he knew that look in Ilarion's eyes. It was the point of no return. He bowed his head, a stiff, resentful gesture. "As you command," my king." Alarion did not acknowledge his submission. He turned his back on his fuming war master and faced Seraphine. The fire was back in his eyes, but it was different now. It was not rage at her, but rage for her. It was a possessive, protective inferno that made her feel both terrified and safer than she had ever felt in her life. He looked at the room, the gilded cage that had been her prison, with disgust. He looked at the forgotten tray of food, the book lying on the floor. He saw not a comfortable confinement, but an isolation that had left her vulnerable. "This changes nothing of your guilt or innocence in this matter," he said to her, his voice rough, as if the words were being forced out. It was the king trying to reassert control, to frame his primal, protective act in the cold language of logic. "But your fate will be decided by me, and me alone, not by a fanatical interpretation of an ancient text." He strode to the door and pulled it open. "The discussion is over. Gaiden, you are dismissed. Malachi, return this scroll to the archives. It is not to be spoken of again." Gaiden stalked out, his back rigid with fury. Malachi lingered, his face etched with worry. "My king, this will not be so easily silenced. Gaiden has the ear of half the council. They will see this as proof that the witch has you under her spell." "Then let them," Alarion retorted without looking at him. "And you may remind them who their alpha is." Malachi bowed his head and retreated, leaving Alarion and Seraphine alone in the sudden, ringing silence. The air still crackled with the aftermath of the confrontation. Alarion stood in the doorway, his broad shoulders blocking out the light from the hall. He turned and his gaze swept over her, a long, searching look that felt as though it were peeling back layers of her skin to see the soul beneath. The space between them, no longer a chasm of horror, was now a taut wire of unspoken, impossible connection. He had justified his pack, his law, and his own supposed salvation for her. The knowledge of it was a terrifying, exhilarating weight. "Your cage has become a target," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "You are no longer safe here." Her heart leaped into her throat. Was he letting her go? But his next words crushed that fledgling hope. "You cannot be left alone. I cannot trust anyone to guard you, not anymore." He took a step back into the hall, his eyes never leaving hers. His gaze was an order, a pull, an undeniable command that resonated with the bond deep inside her. It was the alpha, calling to a member of his pack. It was the wolf, calling to its mate. "Gather your things." He glanced around the sparse room. "Whatever you have." She looked down at her worn dress, at the small book on the floor. That was all she possessed in the entire world. She bent and picked up the book, clutching it to her chest like a shield. "Where are we going?" she whispered. He didn't answer right away. He just watched her, his expression a dark, unreadable map of the war still raging within him. He had won the battle, but the war was far from over. He had simply changed the battlefield. "You are no longer my prisoner," he said, the words seeming to cost him something. "You are now my burden." He turned, his cloak sweeping around him. "You will stay in the adjoining chambers to my own, where I can see you, where I can be sure no one will try to play the hero and fulfill a prophecy behind my back." He paused at the door, glancing back at her over his shoulder, his eyes like molten gold in the shadows. "You will come with me, now." The walk to his chambers was a silent ordeal of suffocating tension. Seraphine followed a pace behind him, the small book of myths clutched in her hand, her senses overwhelmed. The corridor was lined with the stern, painted gazes of his ancestors, each one seeming to judge and condemn her with their silent, aristocratic stares. The scent of him was all around her, a storm of pine, ozone, and the faint coppery tang of his own blood from the cut he'd sustained in the training yard. It was a scent that should have terrified her, but her treacherous body responded with a shiver that was not entirely fear. The bond, no longer a dull ache, was a vibrant humming chord between them, shortened now to an impossibly intimate distance. He led her to a set of massive iron-bound oak doors at the very heart of the royal wing. These were his chambers, the Alpha's den. He pushed one door open and stood aside, a silent command for her to enter. She stepped past him, careful not to brush against him, and found herself in a vast, masculine space that was the very embodiment of the Wolf King himself. It was not a room of soft luxury, but of power and elemental comfort. A fire roared in a hearth large enough to roast a wild boar, its flames glinting off the honed edges of swords and axes mounted on the stone walls. A massive table was strewn with maps of the kingdom, strategic markers laid out like armies awaiting a command. The air smelled of wood smoke, old leather, and hymn. But what dominated the room, what drew her eye and stole her breath, was the bed. It was a colossal thing, carved from the same dark petrified oak as his throne, and heaped with a mountain of black and gray wolf pelts. It was not merely a place to sleep. It was a nest, a throne of its own. Through there, he pointed with his chin to a smaller, unassuming door set in the far wall. Those will be your rooms. They are connected to mine. No other entrance or exit. You will have your privacy, but you will not be out of my reach. The words were a promise and a threat in one. She nodded, her throat too tight to speak, and moved toward the door he'd indicated. She needed to put a wall between them, to have a space where she could breathe air that wasn't saturated with his presence. The adjoining rooms were smaller but still comfortable, with a simple bed, a wash basin, and a narrow window overlooking a secluded inner courtyard. It was Spartan compared to her previous gilded cage, but the privacy felt like a greater luxury than any fur rug. She heard the heavy tread of his boots as he moved about in the main chamber, the clink of a decanter, the rustle of maps. He was a constant, felt presence just beyond the wood and stone. She sank onto the edge of her new bed, her body trembling with reaction. He had chosen her. He had defied his pack, his law, and his own self-interest to protect her life. The knowledge was a terrifying, exhilarating weight in her chest. But why? Was it the bond, a primal instinct he couldn't control? Or was there something else, a flicker of the man beneath the king, that saw the injustice of her fate? She didn't know which possibility frightened her more. Hours later, as twilight bled purple and gray into the sky, a soft knock came not at her hall door, but at the connecting one. She started, her heart leaping into her throat. "Enter," she called out, her voice a reedy whisper. The door opened and Ilarion stood there. He had shed his leather armor and tunic, and now wore only a pair of dark breeches and a loose, open-necked linen shirt. His hair was unbound, his feet were bare, and the firelight from his chamber silhouetted his massive frame. He looked less like a king and more like a primal force of nature. In one hand, he held a tray with a plate of food and a goblet of water. He stepped inside, his presence immediately dominating the small space. "You did not eat the meal that was brought to you earlier," he stated, his voice a low rumble. He set the tray down on the small table by her bed. "I wasn't hungry," she lied. The truth was, after the confrontation with Gaiden, her stomach had been in knots. "Eat," he commanded, though his tone lacked its usual harshness. It was a command born of concern. The thought was so alien, she dismissed it. He didn't leave. He leaned against the doorframe, his arms crossed over his chest, and watched her. The silence stretched, thick and heavy with unspoken things. Seraphine felt compelled to break it. "The girl," she said quietly. "The servant, Elspeth. What happened to her?" His jaw tightened. "She has been released, unharmed." Gaiden was reminded that the king's justice is not his to dispense. Relief washed over her, so potent it made her dizzy. "Thank you." He gave a sharp, dismissive wave of his hand, as if her gratitude were an annoyance. But his eyes lingered on her face. "Why did you lie for her? Why offer to take her punishment?" "Because she showed me kindness when no one else would," Seraphine answered simply. "Kindness should not be a crime punishable by a king's wrath." Her words seemed to strike a chord in him. He looked away from her, his gaze going to the narrow window and the darkening sky beyond. "In this keep," he said, his voice laced with a deep, weary bitterness, "kindness is a weakness to be exploited. It is a currency I can no longer afford to trade in." He sounded lonely. The thought was a revelation. This powerful, feared king, surrounded by his pack, was utterly alone. A man trapped by his crown, at war with the beast inside him, and now shackled by a bond to the one person in the world he was forbidden to want. A wave of empathy, unexpected and powerful, washed over her. "Being alone is not the same as being strong," she whispered, not sure where the words came from. His head snapped back toward her, his golden eyes blazing in the dim light. He pushed off the doorframe and took a step closer, his expression intense. And what would a human stray know of strength or loneliness? "I have been alone my entire life," she said, her voice quiet, but unwavering, hidden away, told I was a shameful secret. I was raised in the shadow of a love story I was never allowed to be a part of. Loneliness has been my only companion. I know it better than I know my own name. Her words hit him like a physical blow. He saw not a political problem, but a mirror. He too was the product of that same story, trapped on the other side of the secret. His loneliness was one of a crowd, a throne, a crown. Hers was one of quiet, humble exile. But it was the same ache. He saw the strength it had taken for her to survive, to walk into the heart of her enemies with nothing but a mark on her arm and a desperate hope. The bond between them shifted. It was no longer just a hum of awareness or a jolt of desire. It deepened, resonating with this new shared understanding. It became a current of empathy, of recognition. He felt the echo of her lifetime of solitude, and she, in turn, felt the crushing weight of his crown. "Eat," he said again, his voice softer this time, rough with an emotion he could not name. He turned and left, closing the connecting door softly behind him, leaving her alone with the food, the silence, and the profound earth-shattering realization that the monster in the next room had a soul that was just as scarred as her own. For the next few days, a strange unspoken routine developed. She would take her meals in her room, brought by him. He never stayed long, but his presence lingered. The rest of the time, the connecting door remained closed, a fragile barrier between their two worlds, but it was a porous one. She could hear him at night, pacing, the restless energy of the wolf bleeding through the stone. Sometimes she would be jolted from a shallow sleep by the echo of a pained growl, a sound of a man fighting a losing battle against his own instincts. She knew his fight was because of her. The proximity was torture for him. He was keeping her close to protect her from his pack. But in doing so, he was exposing himself to the full, relentless force of the bond. It was a constant, maddening pull that drew his wolf toward her, a siren song of instinct that his rational mind had to fight every second of every day. One night, the sounds from his room were worse than usual. She heard the crash of something heavy being thrown against a wall, followed by a low, agonized roar that was more animal than human. It was the sound of a creature in torment. Fear warred with a desperate, inexplicable need to go to him. The bond was a taut wire, vibrating with his pain. Her own heart ached in sympathy. He was suffering, and she was the cause. Before she could think, before she could weigh the risks, she was on her feet. Her hand was on the latch of the connecting door. She hesitated for only a second, then pushed it open. His chamber was lit only by the dying embers in the hearth. He stood with his back to her, his hands braced against the cold stone of the mantelpiece, his head bowed. His shoulders were shaking, his bare back a landscape of corded muscle rippling with tension. An overturned table lay on its side, a shattered crystal decanter glittering like diamonds on the stone floor. He was breathing in harsh, ragged gasps. "Get out," he snarled without turning. He had sensed her the moment the door had opened. She didn't move. "You're in pain." "My pain is not your concern." His voice was a serrated blade. "I told you to get out, Seraphine." The sound of her name on his lips, spoken in that dark, tortured tone, sent a shiver down her spine. Instead of retreating, she took a hesitant step into the room. "Malachi said the bond would tear you apart if you fought it." He threw his head back and let out a harsh, bitter laugh. "And what would you have me do? Surrender? Embrace this blasphemy? Take my sister to my bed to appease the beast inside me?" He turned then, and the sight of him made her breath catch. His eyes were not gold, but burning, molten amber, the eyes of the wolf. His control was hanging by a thread so thin it was almost invisible. "Is that what you want?" he demanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper as he stalked toward her. "No," she breathed, standing her ground though every instinct screamed at her to flee. "I want the pain to stop." "Then you should have never come here," he growled, stopping a mere foot from her. The heat rolling off his body was immense. The air crackled with raw power. "You are the wound. How can you also be the cure?" He reached out, his hand hovering in the air between them, his fingers trembling with the effort of not touching her. She could feel his struggle, the violent war between his duty and his desire. The king wanted her gone, the wolf wanted to claim her, and the man between them was being ripped in two. She did something then that was braver and more foolish than walking into his throne room. She closed the distance between them and placed her small, cool hand over his heart. The contact was a cataclysm. A roar, not of anger, but of pure agonized release, was torn from his throat. His entire body shuddered, a tremor of seismic proportions. He stared down at her, his amber eyes wide with shock. Through her palm, she could feel the frantic, thunderous beating of his heart, a rhythm that was both terrifying and achingly familiar. The bond, which had been a source of torment, a constant pull and push, suddenly flooded with peace. A quiet, profound stillness that felt like coming home. His pain, his rage, the gnawing hunger of the wolf, it all receded, replaced by the simple, overwhelming truth of her touch. His hand, no longer hovering, came up to cover hers, pressing it harder against his chest. His other hand went to her waist, his grip possessive, pulling her flush against him. It was not a gentle embrace. It was an anchoring, the desperate act of a drowning man finding a piece of solid ground. He lowered his head, his forehead resting against hers, his eyes closing as a long, shuddering breath escaped him. "Moon, forgive me," he whispered, his voice ragged and broken. "You feel—" He didn't finish. He didn't have to. She knew, she felt it too. Right. This impossible, forbidden, blasphemous thing felt undeniably, terrifyingly right. The space between their heartbeats vanished. In that moment, there was no king, no outcast, no brother, no sister. There were only two halves of a shattered soul, finally, impossibly, whole. The stillness was a fragile bubble in the heart of a tempest. For a long, breathless moment, they stood locked together, her hand over his heart, his arms caging her in. The world outside the circle of his embrace ceased to exist. There was only the thunder of his heartbeat under her palm, the warmth of his breath on her hair, and the overwhelming, undeniable rightness of his touch. The wolf in him was silent for the first time since she had arrived, not beaten into submission, but soothed, quieted by the proximity of its other half. But peace, in a place like Blackwood Keep, was a fleeting illusion. The heavy doors to his chamber burst open, slamming against the stone walls with the force of a battering ram. Seraphine cried out in alarm, and Ilarion spun around, placing his body squarely in front of her, a growl of pure, murderous fury ripping from his throat. War Master Gaiden stood in the doorway, flanked by 4 of his largest, most loyal warriors. They were armed for battle, their swords drawn, their faces grim and determined. Gaiden's eyes, alight with a fanatical fire, took in the scene before him. His king, half-dressed, in a shockingly intimate embrace with the human witch. It was all the proof he needed. "So the prophecy was wrong," Gaiden said, his voice ringing with a cold, triumphant certainty. "She is not the sacrifice. She is the curse itself, and she has consumed our king." "Gaiden!" Ilarion snarled, his voice a low, lethal vibration. The wolf was back, not in agony now, but in a focused, territorial rage. His eyes bled from gold to burning amber. "You have made your last mistake. Leave this room now, and I may let you live to see the dawn." "We are not here to challenge you, my king," Gaiden replied, though his stance was that of a man ready for war. "We are here to save you, to save the pack. We are here to perform the ritual of cleansing, with or without her consent, with or without yours." It was treason, open and absolute. Gaiden was staging a coup, using the prophecy as his justification, his banner of righteousness. He was banking on the fact that the rest of the pack, already seated with fear and doubt, would see this as a necessary, holy act. "You will not touch her," Ilarion said, the words falling like chips of ice. He pushed Seraphine gently behind him, his arm a solid bar of muscle across her body. "We will," Gaiden said. He gave a sharp nod to his men. "Seize her." The 4 warriors surged forward. Ilarion met them with a roar that shook the very foundations of the keep. He moved with a speed and brutality that was terrifying to behold. He was not the king, bound by law and reason. He was the alpha, defending his mate. He grabbed the overturned table and hurled it at the advancing men as if it were a child's toy, sending 2 of them crashing to the floor. He drew a massive, double-edged axe from its mounting on the wall, its polished steel gleaming in the firelight. The chamber erupted into a maelstrom of violence. The clang of steel on steel echoed off the stone, a brutal symphony of betrayal. Seraphine screamed as one of Gaiden's men lunged for her. Alarion intercepted him, his axe swinging in a deadly arc that shattered the man's sword and sent him staggering back, his arm bleeding profusely. But there were too many. While Alarion was engaged with two of the warriors, Gaiden and the fourth man skirted the fight, their eyes fixed on Seraphine. Gaiden was faster than a man his age had any right to be. He seized her arm, his fingers like a vice. "The Heartstone awaits," he hissed, his breath hot and foul. Alarion saw. A sound of pure, feral desperation was torn from his throat. He threw off his attackers with a savage shove and lunged toward Gaiden, his face a mask of murderous intent. But the fourth warrior threw himself at Alarion's legs, a desperate, suicidal tackle that brought the giant king crashing to his knees for a crucial second. It was all the time Gaiden needed. He dragged the struggling Seraphine out of the chamber and into the corridor, shouting to his men, "Hold him, for the good of the pack!" "Alarion!" Seraphine screamed his name, a raw, terrified cry that was cut short as Gaiden clamped a hand over her mouth. She heard Alarion's roar of absolute, unrestrained fury behind her, a sound that promised a bloody and terrible retribution. But Gaiden was already dragging her down the hallway, his fanaticism giving him inhuman strength. They clattered down a spiral staircase, emerging into the cold night air of a deserted courtyard. The blood moon was rising. It hung in the sky above the keep, a malevolent, weeping eye the color of a fresh wound, bathing the world in an eerie crimson light. Gaidon's men had been thorough. A horse already saddled stood waiting. He threw her onto its back and leaped up behind her, wrapping one arm around her waist like a band of iron. "You will save us all, little witch," he grunted in her ear as he spurred the horse into a gallop, away from the keep and into the dark, waiting maw of the Blackwood. The ride was a nightmare of jarring speed and choking fear. Branches whipped at her face, and the cold night air burned her lungs. All she could think of was Alarion. Of the sound of his rage and desperation. Was he hurt? Had his own men, his own war master, managed to subdue their alpha? The thought was a cold knot of dread in her stomach. They rode for what felt like an eternity, deeper and deeper into the forest, until the trees grew so old and thick that their branches blotted out the red moonlight. Gaiden finally reined the horse to a halt in a small clearing. The air here was different, heavy, ancient, and humming with a strange, latent power. In the center of the clearing was a single, massive slab of black rock, flat and unnaturally smooth. It was covered in ancient, eroded carvings that seemed to writhe in the crimson light. The Heartstone altar. Two more of Gaiden's followers were waiting for them, holding torches that cast flickering, monstrous shadows. They pulled her from the horse and dragged her toward the stone. "Bind her," Gaiden commanded. Seraphine fought. She kicked and clawed and bit with a ferocity she didn't know she possessed. It was the frantic, desperate struggle of a cornered animal. For a moment she broke free from one man's grasp and scrambled away, but the other caught the back of her dress, and she went down hard, the breath knocked from her lungs. They dragged her the last few feet and forced her onto the cold, unyielding surface of the altar, tying her wrists and ankles with rough rope. She lay there panting, staring up at the blood-red moon through the canopy of leaves. This was it. This was the end her mother had never foreseen. She was going to die here, a sacrifice to a god she didn't know, for a people who hated her. Gaiden stood over her, a long ceremonial knife in his hand. The blade was obsidian, sharp and black as a shard of night. "The goddess asks for your willing sacrifice," he said, his voice a low, hypnotic chant. "Give your blood freely, and your death will have meaning. It will be a song of salvation for our people." "Never," she spat, the word full of all the defiance she had left. Gaiden's face hardened. "So be it. The ritual will proceed. Your willingness is a courtesy, not a requirement." The king was wrong. He raised the knife, its tip gleaming a malevolent red in the moonlight. Suddenly, a sound split the night. It was not a roar, not a growl, but a howl. It was a sound of such profound loss, such soul-deep agony, and unrestrained fury that the very trees seemed to shrink away from it. It was a sound that promised death. Gaiden and his men froze, their heads snapping toward the direction of the howl. It was answered by another, then another, a chorus of loyalist wolves responding to their alpha's call. A crash echoed through the undergrowth, the sound of a giant breaking through the forest. And then he was there. He exploded into the clearing, a vision of primal vengeance. He was no longer Alarion the king. He was a force of nature. He was shirtless, his chest and arms covered in blood, some his, some not. His eyes were not amber, but solid, glowing spheres of white-hot fire. His teeth were elongated, his face contorted into a feral snarl. He had partially shifted, surrendering to the beast in a way that was terrifying and magnificent. He was the wolf. "You are mine." The words were a guttural snarl, each one ripped from a throat that was no longer entirely human. The promise was not made to her. It was a sentence of death, delivered to Gaiden. Gaiden's men, fanatics though they were not fools. They saw the untempered rage of their alpha, a force that could level mountains, and their courage broke. One of them dropped his torch and fled into the darkness. The other hesitated, then followed, melting into the trees. Only Gaiden stood his ground, raising his obsidian knife. "For the pack!" he screamed, a final desperate cry of conviction. He lunged, not at Alarion, but at Seraphine, his intent clear. If he was to die, he would complete the ritual first. He never made it. Alarion moved faster than sight. He was a black and silver blur of motion. He didn't use a weapon. He didn't need one. He slammed into Gaiden, and the sound of the impact was the sickening crack of bone and cartilage. He threw the War Master to the ground and fell upon him, and the last thing Seraphine saw before she squeezed her eyes shut was the flash of claws and teeth and the spray of hot, dark blood. The sounds were horrific, a wet, tearing symphony of retribution that seemed to go on forever. When it finally stopped, a profound silence fell over the clearing. Slowly, fearfully, she opened her eyes. Alarion stood over what was left of Gaiden, his massive chest heaving, his body drenched in the blood of his enemy. He was shaking, not from exhaustion, but from the sheer, overwhelming force of the adrenaline and rage coursing through him. He turned his head slowly, and his glowing, feral eyes found her, bound and helpless on the altar. A low, pained sound, half whimper, half growl, escaped him. He stalked toward the altar, and for a terrifying moment, she wasn't sure if the man was still in there at all, or if it was only the beast, come to claim its prize. He reached her, and instead of tearing her apart, he fell to his knees. He raised his hands that were still tipped with claws, and with a gentleness that was in stark contrast to the violence he had just wrought, he sliced through her ropes, freeing her. He didn't speak. He couldn't. He simply reached for her, pulling her off the cold stone and into his arms. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, his entire body trembling as the last of the savage battle rage left him, replaced by a profound, shuddering relief. His arms wrapped around her, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe, as if he were trying to merge their two bodies into one, to ensure she could never be taken from him again. She clung to him, her face pressed against his blood-slicked shoulder, her tears finally coming, hot and silent. He was here. He was alive. He had come for her. He had chosen her over everything. He pulled back just enough to look at her, his eyes fading from glowing white back to molten gold. The king was returning, dragging himself back from the brink. He raised a hand and gently cupped her cheek, his thumb stroking away a tear. His touch was a brand, a claim, a promise. In the crimson light of the blood moon, surrounded by the carnage of his own making, he had finally and irrevocably made his choice. He was no longer a king torn between duty and desire. He had cast down his crown of law and tradition and replaced it with a crown of thorns, a blasphemous, impossible love for the woman who should have been his sister, who should have been his sacrifice, but who was, in the end, the only thing that mattered. "Mine," he whispered, and this time the word was not a threat or a snarl. It was a vow, a sacred, broken, and beautiful truth. The first snow of winter was falling, each delicate flake a silent white secret drifting down. From a sky the color of pewter, from the high stone balcony of the king's chambers, the world looked clean and new, the dark pines of the blackwood slowly acquiring a dusting of silver, the courtyards of the keep hushed and still under the thickening blanket. A year had passed since the night of the blood moon, a year of whispers, of rebuilding, of forging a new kind of peace from the ashes of betrayal. Seraphine drew the heavy fur cloak Alarion had given her tighter around her shoulders. It was made from the pelt of a great shadow wolf, black as night and impossibly warm. In the court, they had a name for her now. They did not call her princess or queen. Those titles were for women of pure shifter blood, for political alliances and ancient bloodlines. They called her Skathana, the king's shadow. It was a name born of fear and superstition, meant to mark her as something other, something spectral and unsettling. But she had taken the name and worn it as armor, for in a way, it was the truth. She was the shadow that calmed his fire, the quiet that soothed his storm. She was the one who walked where no one else dared, in the twilight space of the king's own heart. The keep was not the same. Gaidon's treason had cut a deep wound through the pack. Alarion had been merciless in its aftermath. The warriors who had stood with their war master had been exiled or executed. Their families were stripped of rank. It was a brutal, necessary purge that had left scars on them all. Some still looked at her with hatred in their eyes, loyalists to the old laws, who saw her as the source of all their strife. They whispered that the king was bewitched, his alpha instincts compromised by a human curse. But many more, the ones loyal to Alarion, above all else, had seen his choice for what it was, the ultimate act of an alpha protecting what was his. They saw the new calm in their king, the focused strength that was no longer wasted on fighting his inner demons, and they gave her a grudging, wary respect. She rested her hands on the cold stone of the balustrade, her gaze sweeping over the kingdom below. Her kingdom. Not by right of a crown, but by right of the king who held it in his grip. She was no longer the frightened, ragged girl who had walked into the throne room with a secret on her arm. She had found her voice in the quiet moments, her strength in the heart of the wolf who had claimed her. She was Alarion's advisor, his confidant, the only one who could meet his fiery gaze without flinching. Her human perspective, once seen as a weakness, had become his greatest strategic asset, a viewpoint that allowed him to see beyond the pack's often blinding traditions. The heavy door to the balcony slid open, and she felt his presence before she heard him. The air changed, warming, thickening, charged with the familiar energy of his power. A pair of strong arms circled her waist from behind, pulling her back against a chest that was as solid and unyielding as the mountain itself. He rested his chin on her shoulder, his breath a warm cloud in the frigid air. He said nothing, simply holding her, watching the snow fall with her. This was their new language, a language of quiet touches, of shared silence, of a bond that hummed between them, no longer a source of torment, but a constant, comforting reassurance. He was here. She was safe. They were whole. The first snow, he rumbled, his voice a low vibration against her back. The world is quiet for a moment. It is, she agreed, leaning into his embrace. She turned her head, her cheek brushing against the rough texture of his jaw. Is the council meeting over? It is, he sighed, a sound of weary satisfaction. The southern lords have agreed to the new trade terms, even without the marriage alliance they were hoping for. He nuzzled the side of her neck, his scent of pine and winter air enveloping her. It seems a king who is willing to tear apart his own war master for the woman he wants is a king they are unwilling to argue with. She smiled faintly. His ferocity, once a source of terror, had become her shield. So my presence is good for something other than causing civil unrest. He turned her in his arms, his golden eyes soft in the gray afternoon light. The wild, tormented fire was gone, replaced by a deep, steady glow. The scars on his face and body were a map of his past, but the scars on his soul, the ones she had felt through the bond, were healing. My presence, he corrected her gently, is nothing without yours. He reached up and tucked a stray strand of her hair behind her ear, his calloused fingers surprisingly gentle against her skin. Malachi has been studying the old texts again. He believes Gidon misinterpreted the prophecy. The word he translated as sacrifice can also mean offering. He believes your blood was never meant to be spilled on an altar. Seraphine looked up at him, her heart stilling. Then what was it for? He believes the offering was your heart, Alarion whispered, his gaze intense, that you had to willingly give yourself to the bond, to me, and that I, in turn, had to offer my own sacrifice. What did you sacrifice? She asked, though she already knew the answer. Everything, he said simply. My duty as Gaiden saw it, my pack's traditions, the laws of my ancestors. I sacrificed the king I was supposed to be for the man I needed to become. For you, the sliver of ruin, the curse of my bloodline. It was a fire that burned because it was alone. Your calm, your humanity, your love. It didn't extinguish the fire. It gave it a hearth to burn in. It gave it a home. Tears welled in her eyes, hot against the cold air. The outcast, the abomination, the half-breed stray. She was his home. She raised a hand to his cheek, her fingers tracing the jagged line of his oldest scar. You were never a monster, Ilarion. Just a king with a crown of thorns. And you, he said, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer bothered to hide, are the one who helped me learn to bear its weight. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a kiss of desperate, conflicted hunger like before, but one of deep, abiding certainty. It was a kiss of promises kept and futures written, of two broken souls who had found their salvation in a bond that should have destroyed them. It tasted of the cold winter air, the warmth of the fire within, and a love that had been forged in blood and defiance. When he pulled away, he kept his forehead pressed against hers, their breaths mingling in the snow-filled air. He looked out at the vast, wild kingdom stretching before them, white and silent and full of promise. It was a kingdom scarred by their story, remade by their choice, a kingdom that was finally, truly theirs. They called you my weakness, he murmured, his thumb stroking her cheek. The fatal flaw in the vein line. They were wrong. He looked back down at her, and in his eyes, she saw her past, her present, and all of her tomorrows. You were never my weakness, Seraphine. You were the only thing that ever made me strong. She leaned into him, her head resting over his heart, listening to its slow, steady beat. The snow continued to fall, covering the old world in a blanket of new, pristine white. For the girl who had arrived with nothing and the king who had been ready to lose everything, it was not an ending. It was the beginning.